Yeah, I mean, we talk in the L1 when we talk about like the importance of an intake form and working with a new client. And one of the things we talk about lifting, we talk about lifestyle, we talk about injury history, but we also talk about goals. And it's not some like drawn out motivational bullshit about goal setting. It's like really practical. Like, look, what is a goal? It's like a goal is more or less, if you kind of invert it, is clearly outlining the parameters of failure. It's like, okay, what are the guardrails that you're going to run into when you haven't reached the goal? Because that's the most important thing. Because if you clearly don't know what those guardrails are, because you probably haven't run into them yet, and you don't really know. Otherwise, you'd be at your goal. You'd have arrived at the goal. So it clearly outlines the definition of failure. So I think part of the emergence of at least a language of training like an athlete, and there's training like an athlete and there's training an athlete, which are two separate things. Like part of the emergence and popularity, I think, is the relatability, right? The more transparency we have into the lives of pro athletes, and we see them in the gym, and we realize that, oh, they actually struggle with some of the execution things, and they struggle with some comprehension, and sometimes they miscount on reps too. So we're getting a higher resolution image of what an athlete in a gym looks like now. Night and day, right? I mean, there's a kid I worked with 3 years ago who's he's a safety for the Green Bay Packers. His name is Eric Stokes. He's out of Georgia, the track and field athlete, and obviously a college football player. When lunging, he could not coordinate his upper and lower body. He would lunge like Frankenstein. He would lunge left arm forward with left foot. It was like watching the Michael Jackson Thriller music video. And like, what the fuck is going on? So you'd look at this guy as a general fitness enthusiast or a gym goer, and you'd be like, this guy I think he ran a 10.4 or 10.5 100-meter on 2 torn hamstrings, and then ran a 4.23 40 like 3 months later at the combine, like at 198 pounds, 6'3", one of like probably the largest to ever run a sub 4.3. But you watch him lunge and you're like, oh, he's just like me. It's like, yeah, except for one thing. When this guy hits max velocity, you can't even see him. But yeah, other than that, with the box jumping shit and the lunging, he's just like you. But so I think the relatability is one, which is a huge takeaway. And it's a huge takeaway whether you train bodybuilders. It's a huge takeaway if you train general population clients. Relatability becomes a cornerstone to a fitness business, period, regardless of what your niche is. That I think is big. And as people try and become more, whether it's academically superlative, whether it's physically superlative, your relatability actually starts to shrink. And if you look at people making the most amount of money in this industry, it's YouTube kids that are hyper relatable, right? Which usually means they're not in that great of shape, right? But they're likable and they kind of have a transparency about the struggles they have in the gym. So I think that's thing number one. Thing number two is, yeah, like you said, the ambiguity of the goal. Right? All you really need to do is have neon shoes that match the shorts you're wearing over your Under Armour pants, and you're kind of like halfway there, right? And you can justify, maybe you wear some wide receiver gloves for no reason when you're doing a drill inside of a gym inside of Toronto. But so I think there's good and bad takeaway. I mean, I think there are takeaways that we can look at and cross apply to training principles in general. One, I think being relatability is big. But I think when we get down to it, when the thing we all unanimously understand about athletic training is probably a few things. I would say my first out of the jump, and no pun intended, would probably be something that includes different planes of motion that we train in. I think that at large, if you were to, without people really understanding what change of motion or planes of direction are, frontal, sagittal, transverse plane, I think they would know it if they saw it, right? And they definitely know when it's not present. Right. So if you could put like a power lifter next to someone who's training like an athlete, squatting could be a part of it, but you're probably going to see someone enter into a change of direction or an exercise that exists outside of just front to back, sagittal plane, flexion, extension. So I think that's criteria number one. If we were to let's try and define what it means to train as an athlete, as a general heuristic, I think most people are going to go, well, we need exercises that exist and are loaded in some way within the different planes of motion. So something that's front to back, something that's side to side, and something that's more rotational. Rotational being the one that we probably see the least in conventional resistance training, but probably going to see increasingly more so as people get into whatever training like an athlete is. So that's like the first that comes to mind for me is the planes of motion.
Yeah, I think the first thing there, outside of planes of motion, I think the one underlooked thing that comes to my mind more now as it, I would say I train like an athlete, ironically to this, more so, but it's rhythm, like rhythm and cadence. I think that's something we see in all athletics is all athletics have to some degree a low-lying necessity for rhythm. Basketball has a rhythm. When you see someone dribble a ball, there's an inherent rhythm to that. A long jumper has a rhythm. A hockey player you played hockey for a long time. There's a rhythm and cadence to stride length and contact and the way you take a corner going in versus coming out of a corner, the way you cross a blue line. Like there's an inherent rhythm to, even skating itself. And in baseball, there's going to be to some level of rhythm to both batting and to throwing. So I think, something that I consider more than now or more often than not now is the rhythm. So like moving outside of planes and then, is there a rhythmic component to what I do in a session?
To quote one of the greatest athletes of all time, feel the rhythm, feel the rhyme, get on up. It's bobsled time. Yes, of course.
Right.
It's probably one of the most dynamic athletes. Really a triple threat there, Sanka in the back with his lucky egg. If you don't know Cool Runnings, just turn off the pod now. Go do yourself a favor. Homework. Mandatory reading here at RX Radio. I think we could look at a general pool of exercises. And this is where I think this is where the conversation I think can get a little bit nuanced. That most people would agree are athletic in the way we categorize them. And I think there'd be generally some flaws in throwing these exercises in, especially when we get to general population. So like, anything jumping and landing, anything change of direction, anything where rhythm, timing, and velocity to a certain degree, like true velocity, not like my tendo unit on my deadlift, the fishing line attached to my yo-yo said I moved a bar. That's not velocity, dude. Like it's a reading of something, but speed ultimately has to be fast, which is like kind of in some ways it's a useless trope and useless totality, but in other ways it's actually the most meaningful thing when it comes to driving a specific adaptation. It's like speed has to be fast, right? Yeah. Like speed slow is not speed, right? So if 7.6 meters per second on a deadlift is like, okay, whatever, that's, at max velocity, Usain Bolt is running 17 meters per second, maybe hits the 70 meter mark. That's probably how fast he's going. So it's like, these things are dependent because we look at a lot of athletic movements. They're usually not constrained necessarily by barbell or dumbbell. They're usually multi-joint, potentially multi-planar. There might even be a reactive component to it where it requires a change of direction, right? That amortization phase of like, okay, we're slowing down, stopping, and then speeding up and accelerating, right? So we're this change of direction, absorption, production, and transferring of force. And then there's usually a component of body weight, right? Yourself becomes the machine. And this is where I think a lot of trainers are set to really pay attention to how they categorize exercises, because it is such a drastic variable from individual to individual and can carry with it much different adaptations, whether it be, adaptations maybe at a bony level, right? Adaptations at a tissue or tendon level, adaptations at a muscular level. Right. So this is where, I think we would all, if we were all to come together and do a whiteboard session, and everyone who listens to this podcast would be like, I think these movements are athletic. And we weren't trying to be like some know-it-all outlier. Like, bench press, you're talking to Kyle Rogers the other week. One of the highest correlations to like max velocity in pitching is like bench press. Like go figure. Not the most functional thing in the world, the way shoulder mechanics, but hey, guys that are fucking ripping 100 probably have a stronger upper body. If for no other reason, that strength is an indication of durability, which is, but if we were just to be like, hey, let's just be very generic in the way people think about athletic training, we'd probably come up with a list of bodyweight exercises that probably have, a change of direction, compound in nature, and probably, again, just don't have the constraint of a machine. The variable of body weight is huge. That's the pin that goes into the plate loaded machine. And it's a really different adaptation when people start playing with different pins. And so you'll see clients or trainers in gyms where this is sort of their bag and they like training people like athletes. The same exercise performed by someone with a different relative strength to body weight ratio is a different exercise.
Yeah.
So if we look at sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think that's something that gets massively overlooked in the the target the target fitness section aisle of, athletic training like an athlete, like you said, is the relativity to body weight. Because when you look at, at the end of the day, like what is the resistance we're constantly, interacting with, at an exponential level, it's going to be body weight, right? Like depending on gait, depending on, like you said, velocity, the massive thing that changes is how much of my body weight exponentially I am now working with, from 1 times my body weight to 5.8 times my body weight if I'm Usain Bolt in his first 4 strides, right? And if you have an athlete, like you said, with varying levels of strength, the athlete that has an inability to manage for, 1.5 to even 2 times their body weight is going to really struggle when they start to try to put force back into the ground, when it's giving them back, in the tens of times their own body weight.